The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory, 1878, startling Virginia rose from her fitful sleep. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she bolted upright, the nightmare still clinging to her consciousness like the morning dew on prairie grass. Alone in her small homestead, she drew her knees to her chest and listened to the silence that followed, wondering if the sound had been real or just another ghost from her past coming to haunt her dreams. Virginia's life had become a bitter struggle since her father's passing 3 months prior. The once thriving cattle ranch now teetered on the edge of ruin, creditors circling like vultures, waiting for her to falter. At 23, she found herself fighting battles she never imagined against nature, men, and her own despair. As dawn broke over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in watercolor strokes of pink and gold, Virginia rose from her bed. Her blonde hair fell in tangled waves down her back as she moved to the window, surveying the land that had been in her family for 2 generations. The drought had turned the once lush pastures into a sea of brittle yellow, and her remaining cattle grew thinner by the day. "Just need to hold on a little longer," she whispered to herself, the words becoming a daily prayer. The bank had given her until the end of autumn to settle her father's debts, a seemingly impossible task for a woman alone. Virginia dressed quickly in her worn cotton dress, splashed cold water on her face from the basin, and headed outside to begin her morning chores. The air was still cool, but the promise of another scorching day hung heavy. She fed the chickens, milked her only cow, and was heading toward the barn when she spotted a dust cloud in the distance. Visitors were rare and rarely good news. Virginia hurried back into the house, retrieving her father's rifle from above the fireplace. She stood on the porch, weapon ready but not raised, as the lone rider approached. The man who materialized from the dust rode tall on a magnificent black stallion. His broad shoulders were draped in a worn leather duster, and his face remained shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat. Something about his posture, confident yet unthreatening, made Virginia lower the rifle slightly. "Madam," he called out, stopping a respectful distance from the house. "Didn't mean to alarm you. Name's Quentin Vance. I'm looking for work." Virginia studied him carefully. His face was sun-weathered but handsome, with a strong jaw partially hidden beneath a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes, a startling blue against his tanned skin, held no malice, but she'd learned not to trust first impressions. "Not hiring," she replied firmly. "Ranch isn't doing well enough." The man Quentin nodded slowly, taking in the state of the property with a sweeping glance. "I can see that. But I'm willing to work for room and board until you get back on your feet. Good with cattle, horses, and fixing things that need fixing." Virginia almost laughed at his proposition. "And why would you do that, Mr. Vance? Charity isn't common in these parts." "Not charity, madam. Just looking for a place to stay for a spell. Been riding too long." He paused, then added, "I heard in town that the Rose Ranch was having trouble since Jonathan Rose passed. Thought I might lend a hand." The mention of her father's name made Virginia's grip tighten on the rifle. "You knew my father?" "No, madam, just heard about him. Good man from what folks say." Virginia hesitated. She desperately needed help, but trusting a stranger was dangerous. Still, there was something in his direct gaze that felt honest. And if she was being practical, she had little left to steal. "1 week," she finally said. "You can stay in the bunkhouse. It's empty now, but there's a cot still there. First sign of trouble, I want you gone." Quentin tipped his hat. "Fair enough, Miss Rose, I'll earn my keep." As Virginia watched him lead his horse toward the old bunkhouse, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change for better or worse, remained to be seen. The first few days passed in cautious observation. Virginia kept her distance, watching as Quentin set to work repairing the broken corral fence, patching the leaky barn roof, and tending to the neglected cattle. He worked from sunrise to sunset without complaint, his movements efficient and purposeful. By the 4th day, Virginia found herself relaxing slightly in his presence. During a shared midday meal of beans and cornbread, she finally asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "What brings a man like you to these parts, Mr. Vance? You don't strike me as a drifter with no purpose." Quentin took a sip of water before answering. "Was a Texas Ranger for 7 years, saw things I wish I hadn't, decided it was time for a change. And that change brought you to my doorstep, a ghost of a smile touched his lips, was headed north. Heard Wyoming was beautiful country. Then I passed through town, heard about your situation. He paused. Seemed like a place I might be useful. Virginia considered his words. Rangers have a reputation, good fighters, most of them. Had my share of troubles, he admitted, but that's not who I am anymore. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant sound of approaching horses. Virginia rose quickly, moving to the window. Her stomach knotted at the sight of 4 riders approaching. She recognized the lead man immediately. Trouble? Quentin asked, already on his feet. Edgar Holloway and his men, Virginia explained grimly. He owns the neighboring ranch. Been trying to buy our land since before Pa died. Doesn't take kindly to rejection. Quentin nodded, understanding the situation without further explanation. Want me to handle this? Virginia squared her shoulders. No, this is my fight. Together they walked onto the porch as the riders approached. Edgar Holloway was a large man with small, calculating eyes and a perpetual sneer. His 3 companions were hired guns, their expressions blank and dangerous. Miss Rose, Holloway called out, his voice falsely pleasant. Thought I'd stop by and see if you've reconsidered my offer. My answer's the same as it was last month, Mr. Holloway. The Rose Ranch is not for sale. Holloway's gaze shifted to Quentin, standing slightly behind Virginia. I see you've hired help. Must be desperate times indeed. My business is my own, Virginia replied coldly. Perhaps, Holloway agreed with a thin smile, but business becomes everyone's concern when debts go unpaid. The bank tells me you've got until November to settle up. That's not long, Miss Rose. Virginia felt her face flush with anger. You had no right to discuss my affairs with the bank. Just looking out for my interests. When you fail, and you will fail, I want to be first in line to claim this land. His eyes hardened. It should have been mine years ago, before your father cheated me out of it. Quentin stepped forward then, his stance casual but his eyes alert. Sounds to me like the ladies made her position clear. Maybe it's time you moved along. Holloway assessed Quentin with narrowed eyes. Don't believe I know you, stranger, Quentin Vance. A flicker of recognition crossed Holloway's face. The ranger from Texas heard stories about you, he laughed humorlessly. Hiring a gunslinger won't save this ranch, Miss Rose. You're just postponing the inevitable. Virginia lifted her chin defiantly. Good day, Mr. Holloway. With a final warning glance, Holloway turned his horse. You've got until the first frost, then my offer drops to half after that. He left the threat hanging in the air as he and his men rode away. Virginia's hands trembled with suppressed rage. That man has been a thorn in my side since I was a child. He and my father had some dispute over water rights years ago. Pa won in court, and Holloway never forgave him. Men like that don't stop until they get what they want, Quentin observed quietly. Well, he's not getting my ranch, Virginia declared, though her voice lacked the conviction she wished it had. Quentin studied her face for a moment. You said your father left debts. How bad is it? Virginia hesitated, unaccustomed to sharing her burdens. Finally, she sighed. Bad enough. The drought last year hit us hard. Pa took loans to keep things going, then he got sick. Doctor bills, medicines, it added up. Now the bank wants payment, and I've got fewer than 60 head of cattle left to sell. How many do you need to cover the debt? At current prices, at least 100 more, and healthy ones, not the half-starved creatures we have left. She shook her head. I've tried everything, Mr. Vance. Every solution leads to the same end, losing this land. Quentin was quiet for a long moment. There might be another way. I've heard talk in town about a cattle drive heading north to the railroad in 2 weeks. Buyers there are paying top dollar. If we could fatten up your stock enough by then. We'd still be short, Virginia finished. And Holloway knows it. That's why he's so confident. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Virginia sat on the porch steps, watching Quentin as he worked with one of her horses. The animal had always been skittish, but under his patient handling, it was gradually calming. There was a gentleness to him that contradicted the reputation of a Texas ranger. For the first time in months, Virginia allowed herself to acknowledge how bone-tired she was. Fighting alone had taken its toll, not just physically but on her spirit. When her father died, something inside her had broken, a fracture that widened each day as she struggled to hold onto his legacy. The next morning brought unexpected hope. Virginia awoke to the sound of voices and found Quentin speaking with a young Cherokee man named Thomas Eagle, who lived on the reservation lands to the east. Thomas occasionally traded with Virginia's father and had become a trusted acquaintance. "Thomas brings news," Quentin explained as Virginia joined them. "A herd of cattle, nearly 200 head, was spotted 10 miles south of here, near the canyon lands." Thomas nodded. "Maverick cattle, no brands. They've been running wild since the Carter outfit went under last winter." Virginia's pulse quickened. "Unbranded cattle belong to whoever brings them in." "That's right," Quentin confirmed. "If we could round up even half that herd, we'd have enough to pay the bank," Virginia finished, hope rising in her chest for the first time in months. Thomas looked between them. "It won't be easy. That's rough country and those cattle have gone feral. You'd need more hands than just the two of you." "How many men could you bring?" Quentin asked directly. Thomas considered. "Maybe 5, including myself. We could use the work." "That might be enough," Quentin mused. "With good horses and experienced riders." Virginia's mind raced with possibilities. "I have the horses. They're not much to look at, but they know cattle work." "We'd need to move fast," Quentin warned, "before Holloway gets wind of this." "If those cattle are where Thomas says, they're technically on open range, but close enough to his property that he might try to claim them." For the first time in months, Virginia felt the spark of determination replace the dull ache of despair. "Then let's not waste time." "Thomas, can your men be ready by tomorrow?" The young Cherokee nodded. "Dawn will come prepared." After Thomas departed, Virginia and Quentin spent the rest of the day preparing. They checked tack, counted supplies, and planned their route. As evening fell, they sat by the fire in Virginia's small kitchen, maps spread across the table. "We'll head south along the creek," Quentin traced the path with his finger. "Then cut east through the canyon. If the cattle are where Thomas says, we can drive them north along this ridge, avoiding Holloway's land entirely." Virginia studied his face in the flickering firelight. "Why are you doing this? You barely know me, and this isn't your fight." Quentin's blue eyes met her steadily. "Maybe I'm tired of fights that aren't mine. Maybe this one feels worth taking on." Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that made Virginia look away first. "Well, I'm grateful for the help, however it turns out." "It'll turn out," Quentin assured her. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will be a long day." Virginia rose from the table, suddenly aware of how close they'd been sitting, how the small kitchen had grown warm not just from the fire. "Good night, Mr. Vance." "Quentin," he corrected gently. "Think we're past formalities now," she nodded. "Good night, Quentin." "Good night, Virginia." Her name on his lips sounded different, somehow softer, more personal. She hurried to her bedroom, confused by the flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with tomorrow's plans and everything to do with the man who had appeared in her life like an answer to an unspoken prayer. Dawn broke with clear skies and a cool breeze, perfect weather for a cattle drive. Thomas arrived with 5 men as promised, all mounted on sturdy ponies and equipped for the work ahead. Virginia had prepared food for the journey, and Quentin had loaded extra supplies onto a pack horse. As they rode out, Virginia felt a surge of hope stronger than she'd experienced since her father's death. The small company moved south at a steady pace, with Quentin and Thomas riding point. Virginia found herself studying Quentin's profile against the rising sun, noting how naturally he took to leadership, how the others deferred to his quiet authority. By midday, they reached the canyon lands, a maze of sandstone formations and scrub brush. Thomas led them through a narrow pass, then signaled for a halt. Ahead, in a sheltered valley with a small spring at its center, dark shapes moved against the landscape. "There they are," Thomas whispered, pointing. "Just like I said." Virginia felt her breath catch. Even from a distance, she could see at least 100 cattle grazing in the valley. Wild and rangy, but cattle nonetheless, cattle that could save her ranch. Quentin surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. "They've got water and decent grazing here. That's good, they'll be stronger than we feared. But it also means they won't be eager to leave." "What's the plan?" one of Thomas's men asked. "We'll split into 3 groups," Quentin decided. "Thomas, you take 2 men and circle west. Virginia and I will go east with 1 man. The other 2 wait here at the pass. We'll drive them toward you, then all push north together." Everyone nodded in agreement. Virginia followed Quentin along the eastern ridge, accompanied by a young Cherokee named Joseph. They rode in silence, positioning themselves carefully. "Ready?" Quentin asked her, his eyes searching her face. Virginia nodded, tightening her grip on the reins. "Ready." With a sharp whistle, Quentin signaled the start of the roundup. The three groups converged on the herd simultaneously, whooping and waving their hats. The cattle, startled from their peaceful grazing, began to move in a chaotic mass. Virginia urged her horse forward, helping to turn the leaders toward the pass. Years of working alongside her father came back to her, instantly the rhythm of the chase, the anticipation of the cattle's movements, the partnership with her horse. For nearly an hour they worked to gather the scattered herd. The wild cattle resisted, some breaking away and requiring pursuit. Virginia found herself galloping after a group of yearlings, driving them back to the main herd with determined precision. When she rejoined the others, Quentin gave her an appreciative nod. "You ride like you were born to it." "I was," she replied, unable to suppress a grin of exhilaration. For the first time in months, she felt alive, purposeful. By late afternoon, they had the herd moving steadily toward the north, dust rising in clouds behind them. Virginia counted approximately 150 head, more than enough to save the ranch if they could get them home safely. As dusk approached, Quentin called for them to make camp in a small clearing beside a stream. The cattle, exhausted from the drive, settled down to graze and drink. The humans established a perimeter, setting up a watch rotation for the night. Virginia helped prepare a simple meal over the campfire, aware of Quentin's eyes on her occasionally. When he approached to take a plate of beans and salt pork, their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unexpected warmth up her arm. "You did well today," he said, sitting beside her on a fallen log. "Most ranchers' daughters I've known prefer parlors to roundups." Virginia laughed softly. "I've never been much for parlors. My mother died when I was young, and Pa raised me to help run the ranch. Never saw much point in learning to embroider when there were cattle to tend." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was," Virginia confirmed, her voice softening with memory. "Stubborn as the day is long but fair, he taught me everything I know about ranching, about standing my ground." Quentin studied her face in the firelight. "He'd be proud of you." "Not many would fight so hard." Virginia looked away, uncomfortable with the praise. "I've just been doing what needs doing. Anyone would." "No," Quentin said quietly, "not anyone." Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas, who joined them with a concerned expression. "Riders coming from the south, moving fast." Quentin was on his feet immediately. "How many?" "At least 6, maybe more." Virginia's stomach tightened. "Holloway, someone must have told him about the herd." "Likely," Quentin agreed grimly. "Thomas, get everyone ready." "We need to move the cattle now." "In the dark?" Virginia questioned. "Better than losing them to Holloway," Quentin replied, already striding toward his horse. Within minutes, they had roused the cattle and begun pushing them north again. The herd moved reluctantly at first, then picked up pace as the riders pressed them forward. They traveled by moonlight, navigating the uneven terrain with careful urgency. Virginia rode alongside Quentin, her heart pounding with exertion and worry. "How far behind are they?" "Not far enough," he answered tersely. "We need to reach the ridge before they catch us. Once we're on your land, he'll have a harder time claiming the cattle." They pushed on through the night, the cattle lowing in protest but moving steadily. Virginia's muscles ached, and her eyes strained against the darkness. Twice they nearly lost part of the herd when the animals shied at shadows, but each time the riders managed to keep them together. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, they reached the ridge that marked the southern boundary of the Rose Ranch. Virginia felt a surge of relief as they drove the cattle onto her land. "We made it," she breathed, turning to Quentin with a smile that quickly faded. In the growing light, she could see riders cresting the hill behind them. Holloway and his men had caught up. Quentin's expression hardened. "Keep moving the herd, I'll deal with Holloway." "No," Virginia said firmly. "My land, my fight, we face him together." After instructing Thomas and the others to continue with the cattle, Virginia and Quentin turned to meet the approaching riders. Holloway led the group, his face twisted with anger as he reined in before them. "Stealing cattle, Miss Rose. I thought your father raised you better than that." "These are maverick cattle on open range," Virginia replied evenly. No brands, no claims. We have as much right to them as anyone. Holloway's eyes narrowed. They were grazing on the edge of my property. I've been tracking them for weeks. Yet you never rounded them up, Quentin pointed out. Curious for a man so interested in expanding his herd. I was biding my time, Holloway snapped. And who are you to question my business, Ranger? Last I heard, your jurisdiction ended at the Texas border. I'm not here as a ranger, Quentin replied calmly, just helping a neighbor. Holloway laughed harshly. Neighborly indeed. Well, I have 6 armed men who say those cattle belong to me now. Virginia felt fear curl in her stomach but kept her voice steady. And I have the law on my side. Unless you're planning to commit theft and murder in broad daylight, Mr. Holloway, I suggest you reconsider. For a tense moment, Holloway seemed to weigh his options, his hand hovering near his gun. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. Keep the cattle, Miss Rose, they won't save you. Your father's debts run deeper than you know, and when the bank forecloses, I'll be there to pick up the pieces. With that cryptic warning, he wheeled his horse around. Let's go, boys. Miss Rose and her hired gun think they've won a victory today. As Holloway and his men rode away, Virginia released a shaky breath. What did he mean about Pa's debts? Quentin's expression was troubled. I don't know, but I think we should get these cattle home and then pay a visit to the bank in town. They rejoined Thomas and the others, continuing the drive toward the ranch. By mid-afternoon, they had successfully brought the herd to Virginia's pastures, where the cattle immediately began to graze on the sparse but adequate grass. After thanking Thomas and his men, promising them payment once the cattle were sold, Virginia and Quentin rode into town. The small settlement of Clearwater consisted of a main street with basic establishments: general store, saloon, blacksmith, and at the far end, the Territorial Bank. Inside the bank, Virginia approached the manager, Harold Winters, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetually worried expression. Mr. Winters, I'd like to discuss my father's loans. Winters glanced nervously between Virginia and Quentin. Miss Rose, well, this is somewhat irregular. Perhaps we should speak privately. Mr. Vance is helping me manage the ranch. Anything you have to say can be said in front of him. Reluctantly, Winters led them to his office, a small room with a heavy desk and shelves of ledgers. He pulled one down and opened it with a sigh. Your father's original loan was for $1,200, taken out last spring after the drought. However, there was a second loan for $800 taken 3 months before his passing. Virginia frowned. I knew nothing of a second loan. It's all properly documented, Winters insisted, turning the ledger toward her. Your father's signature witnessed by myself and Mr. Holloway. Holloway, Virginia and Quentin spoke simultaneously. Yes, he happened to be in the bank that day, nothing unusual about that. Virginia studied the signature, her heart sinking. This doesn't look right. Pa's hand was shaking badly by then from his illness. Winters shifted uncomfortably. I assure you everything was done according to procedure. Quentin leaned forward. Was the money from the second loan deposited in Mr. Rose's account? Winters consulted another ledger. Yes, though it appears it was withdrawn almost immediately, a bank draft made out to, that's odd. What? Virginia demanded. The draft was made to Edgar Holloway. For the full amount. Virginia felt as though she'd been struck. My father would never have borrowed money to pay Holloway, they despised each other. Nevertheless, that's what the records show, Winters said defensively. The total outstanding debt is $2,000 due by November 1st. If you've acquired cattle as you say, you should be able to cover it, assuming prices hold at the railroad. Outside the bank, Virginia leaned against a hitching post, trying to process what they'd learned. Holloway forged that loan. Pa was too sick by then to come to town, let alone sign papers. I believe you, Quentin said quietly, but proving it will be difficult. Winters is clearly afraid of Holloway and without evidence. Virginia straightened, determination replacing shock. Then we find evidence. Pa kept records of everything in his study. If he didn't take that loan, there'll be nothing about it in his books. They rode back to the ranch in contemplative silence. The cattle they'd rounded up now grazed peacefully in the pasture, unaware of their role in the unfolding drama. Virginia led Quentin into the house and to her father's study, a small room lined with bookshelves and dominated by a sturdy oak desk. Pa recorded every transaction here, she explained, pulling out a leather-bound ledger. "Every penny spent or earned on this ranch is in these pages." Together they pored over Jonathan Rose's meticulous records. As Virginia had suspected, there was no mention of a second loan, though the first was documented in detail, including a payment schedule. "This proves nothing by itself," Quentin cautioned. "A court would say he simply failed to record it." Virginia continued searching, opening drawers and checking between pages of books. In a locked drawer of the desk, she found a small tin box containing personal papers, her mother's death certificate, the ranch deed, and a sealed envelope addressed to her in her father's handwriting. With trembling fingers, Virginia broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Virginia," she read aloud, her voice thick with emotion. "If you are reading this, I have left this world sooner than I hoped. There are things you must know. Edgar Holloway has been pressuring me to sell the ranch. When I refused, he threatened to ruin us. He has friends at the bank, and I fear he may try to fabricate debts in my name once I am gone. Do not trust anything that comes from Winters or Holloway. The only legitimate loan is the one taken last spring, which I have been repaying monthly. The ranch deed is secure in this box. It is yours free and clear except for that loan. Fight for what is yours, my daughter. You have more strength than you know. All my love, your father." Virginia looked up at Quentin, tears streaming down her face. He knew he was trying to protect me even then. Quentin placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "This letter is evidence, Virginia. With this, we can challenge the second loan. Will it be enough? It might be, but Holloway won't give up easily. He's invested too much in this scheme." Virginia wiped away her tears, a new resolve hardening within her. "Then we don't give him time to react. The cattle drive to the railroad leaves in 3 days. If we can get our herd there and sell them, we'll have enough to pay off the legitimate loan and have proof that the second one is fraudulent." Quentin nodded slowly. "It's a good plan, but Holloway will try to stop us." "Then we'll just have to be ready for him," Virginia said, her father's letter clutched tightly in her hand. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of activity. Virginia and Quentin prepared the cattle for the drive, selecting the strongest animals and ensuring they were well fed and rested. Thomas and 2 of his men agreed to help with the drive in exchange for a fair wage. On the evening before their departure, Virginia sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the western sky in vibrant oranges and pinks. Quentin joined her, offering a cup of coffee. "Beautiful," he commented, nodding toward the horizon. "It is," Virginia agreed. "Pa used to say that Wyoming sunsets were God's way of showing off." Quentin smiled. "Wise man." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Virginia spoke again. "Thank you, Quentin, for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't ridden up that day." "You'd have found a way," he said with quiet confidence. "You're stronger than you give yourself credit for." Virginia turned to study his profile. "Why did you really come here, the truth this time?" Quentin took a deep breath, his eyes still on the horizon. "I heard about Jonathan Rose's death in a saloon in Cheyenne. The men talking mentioned his daughter trying to run the ranch alone. They were betting on how quickly Holloway would drive you out." He paused. "I've seen too many good people lose everything to men like Holloway. Thought maybe I could make a difference this time." "So it was pity," Virginia said, a hint of disappointment in her voice. "No," Quentin replied firmly, turning to meet her gaze. "Admiration maybe, curiosity definitely. But never pity." Something in his eyes made Virginia's heart beat faster. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his. "I'm glad you came, whatever the reason." Quentin's fingers intertwined with hers. "So am I." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then, from the direction of the road, came the sound of approaching horses. They both stood quickly, their brief connection broken by the potential threat. Virginia reached for the rifle that was never far from her side these days. The riders emerged from the gathering dusk, 3 men, none of whom Virginia recognized. They pulled up short of the house, keeping their hands visible. "Evening, madam," the lead rider called. "Name's Marcus Fletcher. Heard you might be joining the cattle drive to Laramie." Virginia exchanged a glance with Quentin before responding. "That's right, we're heading out tomorrow." Fletcher nodded. "Trail boss sent us to escort anyone coming from this direction. There's been trouble cattle rustlers working these parts, safety in numbers," Quentin stepped forward. Mighty considerate. Who's the trail boss this year? Samuel Jenkins, out of Colorado. You know him? Quentin nodded. By reputation, good man. Fletcher seemed to relax slightly. We're making camp by Willow Creek tonight, heading out at first light. You're welcome to join us there or meet on the trail. We'll meet you on the trail, Quentin decided. Should catch up by midday. After the riders departed, Virginia turned to Quentin with concern. Do you trust them? Not entirely, he admitted. But the offer makes sense. Cattle drives do often send out riders to gather strays and smaller herds. He frowned thoughtfully. Still, we'll keep our guard up. Could be Holloway trying to delay us. The next morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for starting a cattle drive. Virginia, Quentin, Thomas, and his two companions set out with their herd, moving at a steady pace toward the northeast, where they would intercept the main trail to Laramie. By mid-afternoon, they spotted dust on the horizon, the larger herd moving in the same direction. As they drew closer, Virginia could see that it was indeed a substantial drive, nearly 1,000 head of cattle with perhaps 20 riders managing them. Fletcher rode out to meet them, accompanied by a weathered man in his 50s whom he introduced as Samuel Jenkins. The trail boss assessed their cattle with an approving eye. Fine-looking herd, Miss Rose. They'll fetch a good price in Laramie. The buyers are hungry for beef this season. Virginia felt a surge of hope at his words. We're counting on it, Mr. Jenkins. You're welcome to join us, Jenkins offered. Safety in numbers, as Fletcher said. We've had reports of rustlers and there's a storm brewing from the west. Virginia glanced at the sky, noticing for the first time the dark clouds gathering on the distant horizon. We'd appreciate that, Mr. Jenkins. Their smaller herd was incorporated into the larger drive, and Virginia found herself riding flank alongside Quentin. The combined herd moved like a living river across the plains, guided by the experienced hands of Jenkins and his crew. As they rode, Virginia observed the easy camaraderie among the cowboys, the way they communicated with subtle gestures and occasional calls. It reminded her of happier days when her father's ranch had employed a full complement of hands. Miss Rose, Jenkins called, riding back to join her. You handle yourself well. Not many women I know could manage a herd like you do. Thank you, Virginia replied. I learned from my father. Jenkins nodded appreciatively. Jonathan Rose had a fine reputation. I'm sorry for your loss. He glanced at Quentin. You found yourself a good man in Vance, though. His name carries weight in these parts. Before Virginia could correct his assumption about her relationship with Quentin, Jenkins had ridden ahead again. She felt her cheeks warm at the misunderstanding, but didn't feel compelled to clarify. That evening, they made camp alongside a small tributary of the North Platte River. The cattle settled easily, and the men established a watch rotation. Virginia helped prepare the evening meal, finding comfort in the familiar routine of camp life. As darkness fell, she found herself sitting beside the fire, listening to the cowboys share stories and occasionally break into song. Quentin sat next to her, their shoulders almost touching as they sipped coffee from tin cups. Jenkins seems to think you're my... Virginia hesitated, not sure how to phrase it. I heard, Quentin replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Does it bother you? Virginia considered the question. No, she admitted finally. It doesn't. Their eyes met in the firelight, and Virginia felt that same inexplicable connection she'd experienced on the porch. This time there were no interruptions, just the crackling of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle. Quentin's hand found hers, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. Virginia, a sudden shout from the perimeter broke the moment. One of the night guards was galloping toward camp, his horse lathered with exertion. Riders coming fast from the south, he called. At least a dozen. Jenkins was on his feet instantly, barking orders. Everyone armed, form a perimeter around the herd. Virginia and Quentin grabbed their rifles and mounted quickly. The approaching riders were visible now, moving swiftly toward the herd from the direction they had come earlier that day. Holloway, Virginia breathed, recognizing the lead rider even in the dim moonlight. Stay close to me, Quentin instructed, his voice tense. The night erupted into chaos as Holloway's men reached the edge of the herd. Gunshots rang out, and the cattle began to panic, some breaking from the main group and scattering into the darkness. Jenkins's cowboys fought to maintain control while simultaneously defending against the attackers. Virginia found herself separated from Quentin in the confusion, desperately trying to turn fleeing cattle while watching for threats. Through the dust and darkness, she spotted Holloway himself, not shooting but directing his men from horseback. Determined to confront him, Virginia spurred her horse in his direction. As she approached, Holloway noticed her and smiled coldly. "You should have taken my offer, Miss Rose," he called over the noise of the cattle. "Now you'll lose everything, the cattle, the ranch, perhaps even more." "The only thing I'll lose is the pleasure of your company," Virginia retorted, raising her rifle. "This ends now, Holloway. I know what you did. I have proof about the forged loan." Holloway's expression darkened. "Proof means nothing if you don't live to present it." He reached for his gun, but before he could draw, a shot rang out from somewhere to Virginia's left. Holloway clutched his shoulder, his face contorted in pain and surprise. Quentin emerged from the dust, his rifle still raised. "The next one won't be a warning, Holloway." Two of Holloway's men rode to their boss's side, supporting him as he swayed in the saddle. Around them, the tide of the battle had turned. Jenkins's cowboys, joined by Thomas and his companions, had driven off most of the attackers and were regaining control of the scattered cattle. "This isn't over," Holloway snarled, blood seeping between his fingers where he clutched his wounded shoulder. "Yes, it is," Quentin replied evenly. "You're going to ride away now, and you're not going to bother Miss Rose or her cattle again. If you do, I'll make sure every law enforcement officer in the territory knows about your forgery and attempted rustling." Holloway's face twisted with hatred, but he recognized defeat. With a jerk of his head to his remaining men, he turned his horse and rode into the darkness. As the dust settled, Virginia found herself trembling with the aftermath of fear and adrenaline. Quentin dismounted and came to her side, helping her down from her horse. "Are you hurt?" he asked urgently, his hands gentle on her arms as he searched her face. "No," she managed, "just shaken." Relief washed over his features. Without warning, he pulled her into an embrace, holding her tightly against his chest. Virginia felt the rapid beat of his heart matching her own, his warmth enveloping her like a shield. "I thought I'd lost you in the confusion," he murmured against her hair. Virginia allowed herself to lean into his strength just for a moment. "It takes more than Holloway to get rid of me." Quentin drew back slightly, his hands still resting on her shoulders. In his eyes, Virginia saw something that made her breath catch a depth of feeling that mirrored her own growing emotions. Jenkins approached them, interrupting the moment once again. "Everyone's accounted for. 2 of my men are wounded, but not seriously. We've recovered most of the cattle, including yours, Miss Rose." "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," Virginia said sincerely. "Don't thank me yet," Jenkins replied grimly. "That storm's moving in fast. We need to secure the herd before it hits." He was right. The clouds that had been distant earlier now loomed overhead, and the wind had picked up considerably. Lightning flashed on the horizon, followed seconds later by the low rumble of thunder. The next few hours were a blur of activity as they worked to gather the remaining scattered cattle and move the herd to higher ground away from the increasingly swollen creek. Rain began to fall, first as a gentle patter, then in sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards. Virginia worked alongside the cowboys, soaked to the skin but determined. By the time they had the herd settled in a relatively protected area, night had given way to a gray, stormy dawn. The rain continued unabated, turning the ground to mud and making every movement an effort. Jenkins ordered most of the crew to seek shelter, keeping only a minimal watch on the nervous but relatively stable herd. Virginia found herself huddled beneath a makeshift tarp with Quentin, Thomas, and several others, all of them dripping wet and exhausted. "Your cattle are safe," Thomas assured her, passing a canteen of coffee. "All accounted for." Virginia accepted the coffee gratefully, her hands still trembling slightly from cold and fatigue. "And Holloway, gone," Quentin confirmed, "for now at least. That wound will keep him occupied for a while." "Good," Virginia said, unable to summon any sympathy for the man who had caused so much trouble. The storm continued throughout the day, making further progress impossible. By evening, the rain had slackened to a steady drizzle, but the ground was too saturated for safe travel with a large herd. Jenkins decided they would remain in place for another day to let conditions improve. As night fell, Virginia found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. The events of the day, the attack, the storm, the constant struggle weighed heavily on her mind. Slipping from beneath the tarp, she walked to a small rise where she could see the herd in the valley below, illuminated occasionally by flashes of distant lightning. The rain had stopped, but everything remained wet, the air heavy with moisture. Virginia hugged herself against the chill, wondering if the railroad buyers would still be waiting when they finally reached Laramie, if the price would be enough, if Holloway truly was finished with his vendetta. So lost in thought was she that she didn't hear Quentin's approach until he draped a dry blanket around her shoulders. She started slightly, then relaxed as he stood beside her. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked quietly. Virginia shook her head. "Too much thinking. About Holloway, about everything." "The ranch, the future," she paused. "What happens after we reach Laramie?" Quentin was silent for a moment. "What do you want to happen?" It was a simple question, but it carried a weight that Virginia felt in her very core. What did she want? For so long, she had focused solely on survival, on keeping her father's ranch, on fighting the next battle. The idea of wanting something beyond that seemed almost foreign. "I want." She began, then faltered. "I want to stop being afraid, to rebuild the ranch. To wake up and not wonder if this will be the day I lose everything." She turned to face him, finding his eyes in the darkness. "And I want to know if you'll still be there when all this is over." Quentin's expression softened, his hand coming up to gently brush a strand of damp hair from her face. "Is that what you're worried about? That I'll leave once we reach Laramie?" Virginia nodded, suddenly vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with cattle raids or bank loans. "Virginia," Quentin said, his voice low and earnest, "I didn't stay for the cattle or the ranch, I stayed for you." The simple truth of his words washed over her like a wave, sweeping away the barriers she had built around her heart since her father's death. Without hesitation, she stepped closer, her hands finding his chest. Quentin's arms encircled her, drawing her against him. When his lips met hers, Virginia felt something inside her ignite a warmth that chased away the chill of the night and the fear that had been her constant companion. The kiss deepened, filled with promise and unspoken feelings. When they finally broke apart, Virginia rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I didn't expect you," she whispered. "When Pa died, I thought I'd have to face everything alone." Quentin's hand stroked her back gently. "You don't have to keep fighting alone, Virginia, not anymore." She lifted her face to his, seeing in his eyes the future she hadn't dared to imagine. "Promise?" "Promise," he replied, sealing the vow with another kiss. The next day dawned clear, the storm having moved eastward overnight. The ground was still muddy, but Jenkins deemed it dry enough to continue their journey. The cattle, restless after being confined during the storm, moved eagerly once the drive resumed. Virginia rode beside Quentin, a new lightness in her heart despite the challenges that still lay ahead. Occasionally their eyes would meet, and she would feel that same flutter in her chest, the recognition of something precious and unexpected. The remaining journey to Laramie passed without major incident. Holloway did not reappear, though Virginia remained vigilant, half expecting another attack. 4 days after the storm, they crested a ridge and saw the town of Laramie spread before them, the railroad tracks cutting through like a steel ribbon. Jenkins rode back to where Virginia and Quentin traveled with their portion of the herd. "We made good time, despite everything. The buyers are waiting at the stockyards. Word is prices are holding steady." Virginia felt hope surge within her. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Jenkins. We couldn't have made it without your help." Jenkins tipped his hat. "It's been my pleasure, Miss Rose. Your father would be proud of what you've accomplished." The process of driving the cattle into the stockyards and negotiating with the buyers took most of the day. Virginia stood firm on her price, bolstered by Quentin's presence and Jenkins's occasional advice. By sunset, the deal was complete. Her cattle had sold for even more than she had hoped, enough to pay off her father's legitimate loan with money to spare for restocking and repairs. As they stood outside the bank in Laramie, the payment safely deposited, Virginia felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "It's over," she said wonderingly. "We did it." Quentin smiled down at her. "You did it. I just helped a little along the way." Virginia shook her head. "No, we did it together." They found rooms at a hotel in town, planning to rest for a day before beginning the journey back to the ranch. That evening, after a proper meal in the hotel's dining room, the first such luxury Virginia had enjoyed in months, they sat in the small parlor, enjoying a moment of peace. "I sent a telegram to the territorial marshal," Quentin informed her. "Explained about Holloway's forgery and the attack on the drive. With your father's letter as evidence, they should be able to build a case against him." Virginia nodded gratefully. "Good. I want him to face justice, not just for me but for anyone else he's cheated over the years." "It might take time," Quentin cautioned. "Men like Holloway have connections." "I can be patient," Virginia replied. "Now that the ranch is secure, I can afford to wait for justice to take its course." Quentin regarded her thoughtfully. "What will you do now?" "With the ranch," Virginia considered the question. "Rebuild, I suppose, hire hands, restock the herd properly, make it what it was when Pa was alive." She paused, gathering her courage. "And I was hoping you might stay." "Not just as a hired hand, but as more." The question hung between them, fraught with meaning. Quentin reached across the small table, taking her hand in his. "I'd like that," he said simply. "More than you know." 2 days later, they began the journey back to the Rose Ranch, accompanied by Thomas and his companions, who had elected to return with them rather than remain in Laramie. The trip seemed shorter somehow, filled with plans and possibilities rather than fear and desperation. As they approached the ranch, Virginia felt a sense of homecoming stronger than she had experienced since before her father's illness. The land that had been a burden now represented hope, not just for survival but for happiness. They crested the final hill, the ranch buildings coming into view in the valley below. Virginia reined in her horse, something about the scene striking her as wrong. "Smoke," Quentin said tensely, pointing to a thin gray column rising from the vicinity of the main house. Without hesitation, they urged their horses forward, racing down the slope toward the ranch. As they drew closer, Virginia's worst fears were confirmed. The main house was ablaze, flames licking at the roof and pouring from the windows. "No," she cried, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped. Quentin caught her arm before she could run toward the burning building. "Virginia, wait, it's too dangerous." From the shadows of the barn emerged a figure Virginia recognized immediately: Edgar Holloway, his arm in a crude sling, his face twisted with malice. "Welcome home, Miss Rose," he called, his voice carrying over the crackle of flames. "Consider this my parting gift." Virginia struggled against Quentin's restraining grip. "You monster, why won't you just leave us be?" "Because your father took what should have been mine," Holloway snarled. "And now I've taken what was his. An eye for an eye, Miss Rose." Quentin released Virginia, stepping forward to face Holloway. "It's over, Holloway. The marshal knows about the forgery. You've added arson to your crimes. There's nowhere for you to run now." Holloway laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "You think I care? I've waited years for this moment." To see a rose finally broken. Virginia straightened, her initial shock giving way to determination. "I'm not broken, Holloway. It's just a house. The land remains, and so do I." Her calm defiance seemed to enrage Holloway further. With a growl, he reached for the gun at his hip. Quentin drew faster, his shot hitting Holloway square in the chest. The man staggered backward, surprise replacing rage in his eyes before he collapsed to the ground. Thomas and his companions had already begun battling the fire, forming a bucket line from the well to the house. Virginia joined them, working desperately to save what they could. Quentin confirmed that Holloway was dead before joining the firefighting effort. Despite their best efforts, the main house was largely destroyed. By the time they had extinguished the last of the flames, only the stone chimney and parts of the outer walls remained standing, blackened and smoking in the fading light. As darkness fell, Virginia stood before the ruins, her face streaked with soot and tears. Quentin approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "About the house." Virginia nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When she finally found her voice, it was steady despite her grief. "My father built that house for my mother. I was born there." "We'll rebuild it," Quentin promised. "Better than before." Virginia turned to face him, finding strength in his unwavering support. "Yes, we will." They made camp that night by the barn, which had thankfully been spared from the fire. Thomas and his men departed after ensuring Virginia and Quentin had what they needed, promising to return in a few days to help begin rebuilding. As they sat beside a small fire, Virginia felt the full impact of the day's events. The triumph of their successful cattle sale seemed distant now, overshadowed by the loss of her childhood home. "Everything my father left me was in that house," she said quietly. "His papers, my mother's few belongings, all our family history." Quentin moved to sit beside her, his arm around her shoulders. "Not everything," he corrected gently. "He left you his courage, his determination. Those can't burn." Virginia leaned into his embrace, drawing comfort from his presence. "And he left me the land. Holloway couldn't take that, at least." "No, he couldn't," Quentin agreed, "and we'll make it thrive again." Virginia looked up at him, struck by his use of we. "You're really staying then, even with all this?" Instead of answering immediately, Quentin reached into his pocket and withdrew a small object. In the firelight, Virginia saw it was a simple gold ring. "I bought this in Laramie," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "Was going to wait for a better moment, but I'm thinking maybe there isn't a better moment than right now, when we're facing our future together." Virginia's breath caught as he took her hand in his. Virginia rose. "I know we haven't known each other long by some measures, but I've seen your heart and your strength, and I know what I want. I want to build a life with you, right here on this land. I want to be by your side through whatever comes next." He paused, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Will you marry me?" Tears welled in Virginia's eyes, not of sorrow this time, but of unexpected joy amidst the ashes of her past. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will." As Quentin slipped the ring onto her finger, Virginia felt a sense of rightness, of coming home in a way that had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with the man before her. "We'll start again," she said, determination replacing grief. "Together." Quentin kissed her gently, sealing their promise beneath the vast Wyoming sky. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Word of Holloway's death and the destruction of the Rose Ranch house spread quickly through the territory. To Virginia's surprise, support came from unexpected quarters. Neighbors who had kept their distance during her struggles arrived with lumber, tools, and helping hands. Even Jenkins and several of his cowboys detoured from their return journey to assist for a few days. Virginia and Quentin were married in a simple ceremony beside the rebuilt corral, with Thomas serving as witness and the local minister officiating. Virginia wore a new dress ordered from the general store in town, and Quentin had his trail clothes replaced with a proper suit for the occasion. As autumn gave way to winter, a new house rose where the old one had stood smaller but sturdy, built to withstand both Wyoming winters and whatever else life might throw at them. Virginia insisted on a large fireplace made from the stones of the original chimney, creating a link between past and future. On Christmas Eve, 6 months after Quentin had first ridden onto her land, Virginia sat beside that fireplace in their new home. Outside, snow fell gently, covering the ranch in a blanket of white. The cattle, a new herd purchased with the proceeds from their successful sale, were safely sheltered in the barn. Quentin entered carrying an armload of firewood, adding several logs to the already crackling fire. He settled beside Virginia on the small sofa they had purchased in Laramie, his arm automatically finding its way around her shoulders. "Happy?" he asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. Virginia leaned into him, watching the flames dance. "Very, though I was thinking about Pa. He would have liked you." "I wish I could have known him," Quentin replied honestly. "He used to say that life on the frontier was about endurance outlasting the storms, the droughts, the hard times." Virginia smiled at the memory. "But I think it's also about finding joy in the midst of those challenges, about not facing them alone." Quentin's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "You'll never have to face anything alone again, that's a promise." As the fire burned low and snow continued to fall outside their window, Virginia thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. The grief and struggles of the past year had forged something precious, a love and partnership that she knew would endure, whatever challenges the frontier might still hold. "I love you, Quentin Vance," she said softly, turning to meet his gaze. "And I love you, Virginia Vance," he replied, the use of her new name bringing a smile to both their faces. Outside, the wind picked up slightly, sending snowflakes swirling past their window. But inside, beside the fire they had built together, Virginia knew she had found something that even the harshest Wyoming winter couldn't touch: a home, not just of timber and stone, but of shared dreams and promised tomorrows. 5 years later, the Rose Vance Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. The house had expanded to accommodate their growing family: twin 3-year-old boys with their father's blue eyes and a baby girl just beginning to walk. Virginia stood on the porch, watching as Quentin taught the boys to ride their first ponies in the corral, his patience and gentle guidance bringing a smile to her face. The land that had once been a burden now supported a thriving cattle operation. They had hired hands, now good men who respected Virginia's knowledge as much as Quentin's. Thomas Eagle served as their foreman, his steady leadership invaluable during the seasonal cattle drives. As Virginia cradled her daughter in her arms, she remembered that night by the dying fire when a lone cowboy had offered her the words she needed most to hear: "You don't have to keep fighting alone." Those words had changed everything, opening her heart to possibilities she had never imagined during her darkest hours. The journey hadn't been without challenges. There had been droughts and blizzards, difficult births and market fluctuations. But they had faced each obstacle together, drawing strength from their partnership and the love that had blossomed so unexpectedly amid adversity. Virginia descended the porch steps as Quentin lifted one of the boys from his pony, the child's laughter ringing across the yard. Her husband looked up, his face breaking into the smile that still made her heart skip a beat after all these years. As he walked toward her, their children running circles around him, Virginia thought about the young woman she had been: afraid, alone, fighting desperately to hold onto her father's legacy. That legacy had evolved into something far richer than land or cattle. It lived on in the family they had created, in the home they had built from ashes, in the love that had transformed two solitary fighters into something stronger together than either could have been alone. Quentin reached her side, planting a kiss on their daughter's head before drawing Virginia into a one-armed embrace. "What are you thinking about? You looked miles away." Virginia smiled up at him, the man who had ridden into her life when she needed him most. "Just that some fires are worth keeping alive, no matter how close they come to dying." Quentin's eyes softened with understanding. He had found her crying beside a dying fire once, both literal and figurative, and he had helped her rekindle not just her hope but her capacity for joy. "Always," he agreed, tightening his arm around her shoulders as they turned to watch their sons race across the yard, their future stretching before them as vast and promising as the Wyoming sky above.